This is the best telephoto lens I've ever used for landscape photography. But more specifically, this lens's focal length is absolutely ridiculous. No matter how close or far my subject is from me, this lens helps me capture it with ease. But just how long is this lens? This is the Nikon Z 28-400mm f4.8 VR, a super zoom lens with a ridiculous focal length that can go from wide to a long telephoto focal length in one turn of the zoom ring. I've been using this lens for the past year and has given me unparalleled confidence to capture whatever subject that I want, no matter how far or close the subject is, which is especially important in landscape photography since compositions are king. And having a lens that can go to almost any focal length you want is a huge advantage. If we take a look at this lens, we can see that the longest focal length you can go to is 400mm. This is much longer than I was previously used to, and it's been nice to have, as I can ensure that no matter how far my subject is, I can capture it with this lens. But I don't necessarily shoot every single image at 400mm. I only use it when my subject is really far away and very small. Subjects like the sun is a very common one for me to shoot at 400mm, as I tend to fill the frame with it and make it a big part of the image. Majority of the time when I'm using the telephoto side of this lens, it will be around 100mm and up. Because although it is nice to have 400mm on the long end, it isn't what I use all the time when capturing a landscape. Having 400mm on the long end simply ensures that I can go to whatever focal length I want and capture the composition every time. Something else I found is that I tend to use these standard focal lengths quite a bit when shooting landscapes, as this lens goes wide at 28mm and means that we have a bunch of different focal lengths to work from in the standard range, which would be between 28 to 70mm, and is nice for those landscapes that tend to feature a lot of elements and require a complex composition to capture it, but isn't so spaced out to require an ultra wide angle lens. This makes it so you don't have to have something like a 24-70 or a standard zoom in your kit, helping to reduce the weight and be more efficient with the lenses we're bringing on our landscape shoots. It's why when I go shoot landscapes, I only bring a 28-400 and 14-30mm as my only two lenses. One camera body I love pairing with this lens is the Nikon Z30. When you put the 28-400mm on this body, you get an effective 42-600mm lens, which is a crazy focal range to work from. But why does this lens get longer? Well, with the Z30, we get an APS-C size sensor that adds a 1.5 times crop onto the lens, helping us get more reach and a longer focal range to shoot from if we wanted to capture subjects that are even farther away. But to me, I found that this isn't super necessary to do. Yes, it is cool having a 600mm lens that can zoom in really far. However, it's quite an extreme focal length, and with subjects that are far, we'll see atmospheric conditions come into play to affect the image's sharpness. I do use 600mm more than you normally think, and having such an extreme perspective is pretty cool since you can capture photos that have a unique compressed feel to them. It does feel like a trade-off though, as you need to use an APS-C size sensor to do this. And compared to a full frame camera, we're essentially trading off our image quality and dynamic range for a longer focal length. But with this lens being at 400mm natively, it seems like that we'll have more than enough reach with a full frame camera. This is something that I'm working out, and will start using my full frame camera paired with the 28-400mm more often. However, earlier I mentioned that this telephoto lens can essentially help you capture almost any composition that you want, but it does have one weakness. And it's all because of the wide angle portion of this lens. The 28-400 will only go wide at 28mm, which is okay if you're not super worried about the wide angle side. But for landscape photography, this tends to be an issue since our subjects are large, and when they're close to us, we want to have that ultra wide angle perspective to capture all the different elements. And to me, 28mm simply isn't wide enough to achieve this. I tend to favor a focal length that's around 14mm or so to get that wide angle look and create compositions that feature all the different subjects I want to showcase, which is why I pair this lens with the Nikon Z 14-30mm f4S. Those two lenses paired together make an incredible combo and are great for tackling any landscape thrown your way. But the wide angle side is why this lens is difficult to recommend as an all-in-one lens for landscape photographers. When using this lens, a tripod is extremely necessary because when we're shooting landscapes, we tend to be at sunset or sunrise, which will have much lower light than in the middle of the day. And since this lens at 200mm and up is brightest at f8, we'll tend to get slower shutter speeds, which is where a tripod comes in to help us craft those compositions more consistently and get images with zero motion blur. But you'll have to be careful when using this lens with certain ball heads, as the one I have will let the lens sag a bit when getting locked in, making it difficult to get consistent compositions with this lens at those more extreme focal lengths. It just depends on the type of ball head that you have, and certain ball heads will be better at mitigating it than others, but it's something to keep in mind. The focal length is the best part of this lens and is what makes it so potent to have as a telephoto lens. It gives you so much confidence, knowing that you can essentially capture any telephoto composition you want without much of a hassle. Now let's move on and talk about the ergonomics of this lens. When it comes to this lens's ergonomics, it's kind of a mixed bag for me. On one end, the plastic build is a little concerning in the long run, as the plastic does tend to feel a bit cheaper. But within this year, I haven't had any issues, and this lens has held up very well with no mechanical problems. I understand that this isn't an S-line lens, but for $1,300 retail, they could have added a little bit better quality to it. However, on the flip side, with the cheaper plastic build of the lens, we do get a much lighter lens overall. The lens comes in at 725 grams, and for a 400mm lens, this is very light. Because if we compare the 28 to 400mm to the 100 to 400, we can see a huge contrast, considering the 100 to 400 is almost twice the weight. Of course, both these lenses have a different use case and different apertures, but for 725 grams, this lens being at 400mm is incredible. And especially for landscape photography, this is a huge advantage. Since we'll be hiking with all this camera gear, we want our equipment to be as light as possible, so we're comfortable for longer periods of time. Something to note with this lens is what kind of camera body you're going to be pairing it with. Because for me, I would pair it a lot with the Nikon Z30, and this created a sort of mismatch, as the Z30 is a super tiny camera body meant to be small, compact, and very portable. But when paired with the 28 to 400, we get a system that is very lens heavy and feels a bit off balance, which is why I recommend using a full frame body like the Z6 to balance the lens out and create a more stable platform when capturing landscapes. It's another big reason why I feel like pairing this lens with a full frame camera body just makes too much sense. One aspect that did bother me a bit was the lack of certain controls, like the AF/MS switch that I thought should have been included, as having that switch makes it so much easier to move between auto and manual whenever I want to go from video to photo, since I tend to use manual focus mainly when shooting landscapes. It's something I wish the 28 to 400mm had, and for a $1,300 lens, I think they could have included it. But the lens does feature a locking switch to ensure the lens doesn't move around a ton when inside of the camera bag. It's nice to have, and to me is very necessary considering how far out this lens can zoom. Overall, I am a fan of this lens's ergonomics, despite some areas that I think this lens could have improved on. It being lightweight and compact is the biggest selling point and makes this lens so much more viable when taking it out to shoot landscapes. But when it comes to how this lens performs when it comes to image quality, that's something we gotta talk about in the next part. The best way I can describe this lens's image quality is just fine. This lens isn't gonna blow you away with the most amazing image quality ever, and probably won't compete with an S-line lens anytime soon. But the images out of this lens are enough to print out large photos, or in order to resolve enough detail from modern cameras. The sharpness from this lens is just fine, and can comfortably get plenty of detail throughout the image. When you zoom in, you can see that the image does tend to be sharp, but isn't resolving detail like the 135mm f1.8s Plena, for example. This lens's sharpness is more affected by atmospheric conditions when using the long focal lengths though. As you zoom in onto a subject that's farther away, you're filling the frame with areas that have more distance between you and the subject, which leave more room for things like smog or hazy conditions to come between you and your main subject. This tends to have more of an impact on how sharp your image is than this lens is able to resolve when it comes to detail. One aspect that was on my mind when I first got this lens was how the aperture performance was on the long end. Because when you went past 200mm, we were stuck with f8 being the brightest aperture we could go to. But for me, this is the aperture I normally shoot at when capturing landscapes, since I like to stop it down to increase our depth of field and get as much corner-to-corner sharpness as possible. However, with this lens going to f8 at around 200mm, the best option to stop it down would be to go to f11. But when shooting with this lens, I rarely found myself ever stopping down to f11 and found the performance differences to be negligible at best. So to me, shooting at f8 has been fine and haven't noticed any major differences between the apertures. If we take a look at the lens's other factors, like color reproduction, I found it to be solid, with flattering colors that have nice saturation and accurate blues and greens. While the micro contrast tends to be on the flatter side, with the images needing the blacks and shadows to be brought down a bit in post-production. The image quality out of this lens is more than good enough for landscape photography and helps me capture lovely images. To me, it's not a strong suit, but won't be the reason why you come out with bad images. It's no S-line lens, but surely gets the job done. Telephoto lenses are all about reach and size when it comes to landscape photography. Having a lens that can go from 28 to 400mm in a compact form factor is such a win for landscape photographers. Not only is it easy to bring around with you on long hikes, but can grab any composition you like no matter how far away it is from you. This lens's focal range is easily what makes it stand out from the rest. Having access to a standard focal range and 400mm on the long end is super useful in capturing far and close subjects alike. And that's what makes this the best lens in the Nikon Z system for landscape photographers. Of course, lenses like the 100-400 will also get you around the same focal length, but is also around 2 times as heavy compared to the 28-400. And you also lose the standard focal range of the 28-400. So instead of getting a lens that's big and bulky, we can grab something that doesn't sacrifice on the focal range while being compact and lightweight for the focal length, especially for a niche like landscape photography that puts you in situations where you can't just adjust the scene as you want. Having a lens that can adjust to whatever situation you're in is a huge win. This lens's versatility is what makes it such a win for landscape photographers in the Nikon Z system, is what I recommend if you need a telephoto lens. This will be my telephoto lens for the foreseeable future and is what I'll be using going forward. But what do you think about this lens? Is it something that you would put in your system? Let me know down in the comment section down below. And make sure to check out my Patreon when you get a chance. I'll be posting a ton on here, and I'm trying to build a community of photographers where we can do photo critiques and things like that. Anyways, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today, and if you like this video, check this one out right here.